Thanks for the interpreters. And I would also like to point out that this meeting is being recorded. You'll see the red recording button, and the recording will figure on the website, on the FERN website later on. So with this, I'm very happy that this topic of deforestation monitoring is of so much interest while we are approaching the holidays. My name is Nicole Polsterer, and I'm a sustainable consumption and production campaigner at FERN. After a few years in the making, the European Commission presented last month on 17th of November its proposal to minimize the risk of deforestation in products placed on the EU market. I trust many of you have already some knowledge about this regulation, either by listening to webinars from the Commission itself or from other organizations. Today, we will discuss how deforestation could and should be monitored to help stop deforestation and help implement this new regulation. We will discuss monitoring today by way of example of Brazil for two reasons. Firstly, because Brazil has a wealth of monitoring systems on deforestation and also suppression of native vegetation in different resolutions by different stakeholders. Really a lot is being monitored in Brazil. And secondly, because deforestation is of concern in Brazil. We've seen Brazil announced high deforestation after the climate conference in Glasgow. And this is also important because Brazil is an important supplier of soya and beef products to the EU. And exactly these and more supply chains linked to the EU will be scrutinized under the new regulation, which our speaker from the Commission will briefly present later on. We will not stop at deforestation. We will also explore whether human rights, especially land tenure rights and enforcement of laws, should also be monitored, so that companies and authorities can implement the new law, either by adapting the risk screening or choose other and more enforcement tools. So this is the remit of today, deforestation monitoring, monitoring of human rights on the example of Brazil. We have a stellar panel of 4 speakers, in addition to a fabulous duo of co-authors of our report, Professor Peter May from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and Saskia Osinger, the co-founder of FERN. Before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to share some guidance on our conference rules, house rules, so to say. So given that we have many, currently we have 130 attendees, we have disabled the chat for everybody, but we do have the question and answer window open. You can field questions on the question and answer window, and we will take them up in the second part of this meeting where we'll have a discussion. We will take questions of clarification of technical terms after each presentation, but it should really just be for clarification of technical terms. In the second part, where we really have the discussion, I might also call on you to explain your question. And in that case, I would like to ask you to kindly switch on your camera and introduce yourself. Otherwise, yes, please do stay on mute when you're not speaking. Our fearless colleague Daria in the back end might mute you if the microphone is switched on by mistake. So I think with this, we can move to our first panelist. I would like to introduce the first speaker, Karolina Sasworkova. She's the International Relations Officer at DG Environment in the Commission. She is responsible for bilateral cooperation with Latin America and Southeast Asian countries. And she's in particular contributing to the implementation of the new legislative proposal and the EU Observatory on deforestation. Before joining the Commission, she was the Deputy Head of Bilateral Cooperation at the Ministry of the Environment of the Czech Republic. Karolina, it's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Brussels. Thank you for the invitation to present at this webinar, part of my work here at the DG Environment of the European Commission. I will have a very short presentation of the draft proposal that we have, or the Commission has adopted on the 17th of November. But the official name you see, it's a very long name, but we a bit paradoxically refer to as the Deforestation Regulation. Perhaps a disclaimer before I start the presentation. This is the draft proposal as adopted by the Commission, and now has the co-decision started. So everything I present to you now is as included in the draft proposal, but a lot of changes can happen as a part of the legislation process with the European Parliament and the member states. Next slide, please. You all are well aware, I believe, about the context and why we have proposed such legislation, the deforestation and forest degradation being a very severe problem worldwide. And especially, I would like to point out that 90% of deforestation, according to FAO data, is caused by expansion of agricultural land. The EU is a major consumer of such commodities and products, and we have a very strong political mandate from the EU citizens to address this issue. Next slide, please. The proposal was also adopted a few days after the COP26 and after the pledges that have been made in terms of deforestation as COP26, not only by our President Ursula von der Leyen, but also from other countries, which of course were welcomed by many NGOs and by other countries. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm just going very quickly through it. The proposal as such has already been announced in 2019 communication of the Commission on a state of world's forest and the stepping up action to protect those. But it's also, of course, embedded in the European Green Deal and its flagship strategies, such as the biodiversity strategy and the farm to fork strategy. So it's not isolated, it's very firmly anchored in everything what the Commission is doing right now. Please, can you switch to the next slide? So also a quick historic background, what has happened since this proposal was announced. To illustrate how important this topic is for the European citizens, you can see that it's as part of the consultation procedure that is always a part of the EU legislation creation, let's say, is that it was the second most popular consultation in EU's history with 1.2 million respondents. So we have very strong mandate, not only from our political figures, but also from citizens. We have also, as part of the consultative proposal, we have consulted third countries and other relevant stakeholders, including industry. And as mentioned, European Parliament and councils have also supported strong measures to fight deforestation and forest degradation. Our deforestation proposal is also supported by evaluation of existing legislative framework, which is the EU Timber Regulation and the Forest Law Enforcement, Government and Trade Regulation, and the impact assessment that is also based on this. So again, it's not something that has come out of nowhere. Again, as I already said, it was adopted by the Commission on 17 November, and now the co-decision procedure has been launched. That might take several years, and we don't expect to conclude it before 2023. The next slide, please. The major objective of our proposal is to minimize EU's contribution to deforestation and forest degradation, and thus also fulfill our commitments in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss that we have taken as part of our international commitments. Specifically, we want to change the setup of international supply chains by not contributing to placing on the market of products that are linked to deforestation, and at the same time promote the use of deforestation-free supply chain and increase the demand for deforestation products. Next slide, please. Very shortly about the scope of the proposal. It covers the commodities, the palm oil, soy, wood, beef, cocoa, and coffee, and some of the derived products from them. Important to mention, of course, is that obligations that stem from these proposals are the same for domestic products, for EU companies, as for companies that come from the third countries. So our proposal is WTO compliant. What we use as a basis for the deforestation-free definition is the 31st December 2020. What it means that commodities that stem from land deforested after this date cannot be placed on the union market. Commodities that are produced on land that was deforested before, or on land, or in general, commodities that were produced before the date, and the operators placing this on the market have to prove that these commodities come from deforestation-free land. The next slide, please. There are, simply put, three main actors under this regulation. Those are operators and traders, member states, and the Commission. So the obligations for the operators are mainly the mandatory due diligence and the assumption of legal obligations from it. So they have to, for example, submit a due diligence statement by which they assume the legal responsibility. As I understand, is a great interest to many of the stakeholders, is the obligation to provide geolocation data. This is part of the due diligence and is one of the tools that we hope is the most important and the most useful for both operators, but also for member states enforcement authorities. The next one, please. Also, perhaps to add here, the geolocation data are linked to the plot of land. So not to a farm as such, to a plot of land that is then defined in the regulation. The second actor, as mentioned, are the member states authorities that are obliged especially to perform checks on the products that are placed on the market. And finally, the Commission has one of the main obligation of the Commission is to set up a benchmarking system to assess countries according to their risk level, and also to set up a register where the operators have to submit their due diligence statement. The next slide, please. As this is very important, especially for our international partners, I will focus here a bit on the assessment criteria of the countries. So to clarify, initially all countries are considered standard risk. And soon after the legislation is finally adopted, the Commission will start assessment of countries or parts thereof. As we propose now are 6 criteria for the assessment that are not, the list is not exhaustive, but here again, we expect a lot of changes coming from the member states and the European Parliament. First, there are 3 criteria that are let's say, straightforward. This is rate of deforestation, rate of expansion of agriculture, and production trends of relevant commodities and products. Here also, the EU Observatory will have an important, although not exclusive, role. So we will look at a lot of international tools, also including the national monitoring authorities to establish those 3 criteria and to use it for the risk level assessment of the country. The 3 other criteria stem partially from the Paris Agreement, also from the UNFCCC's international obligations, for example, the NDCs, but also whether the country has concluded any agreements with the EU. Also to highlight here, before changing the risk status of the country, we will conduct extensive dialogue with the country and to kind of exchange on those data. The next slide, please. So here's to sum up also the cooperation with third parties. There will be, of course, no ban against any country or commodity, as explained. Part of the proposal is also stepping up our cooperation programs with the countries to ensure that they can reap benefits of our proposal. But we are not only cooperate with the producer, but also with the consumer countries such as China and the USA to ensure that our proposal is as efficient as possible, because of course the EU is responsible only for a part of the global deforestation. And finally, part of our proposal is also to work further towards a stronger international definitions. So our proposal is a first step into a broader work towards ending the global deforestation and forest degradation. I will stop at this point. Sorry for the quick run through, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much for taking us through the 80 pages of the proposal in a very short time. I have not seen really questions of clarification of technical terms, but already questions that would go into the content really of the regulation. So I would suggest we take those 2 later. With this, I would like to introduce Frederick Ashar. Yes, he is senior scientist with the Joint Research Center based in Italy, and he has been with the Joint Research Center JRC since 1992. He has co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals in the fields of earth observation and forestry. And Frederick, we're very happy to have you with us and explain how the JRC and the EU Observatory can help monitor deforestation and can help implement the regulation Carolina just presented. Frederick, the floor is yours. And Frederick, you're on mute, I think. Frederick, your microphone does not seem to be picking up.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
So sorry, I had to switch on my camera. I know that sometimes my microphone has a problem. Sorry. So I will, thanks for the introduction, Nicole. I will have present a few slides to show. I have something like 10 slides. So as mentioned by, I don't know if you start to see my slides. I try to go here.
Yes, it works well.
Yeah. So I'm also from the European Commission, like Carolina. I'm working in another Directorate General, which is called the Joint Research Center. So it's a technical and scientific body, Directorate General, which provides scientific and technical support to the other services of the European Commission for implementing their policies. So in respect, so I will show what indeed what is the role of this, what is named the EU Observatory on Deforestation and Forest Degradation, even the title is longer. EU stands for European Union, means that it's implemented by the European Union, but it's an observatory which has a global scope. The observatory is defined, is already announced in a communication of the European Commission dated 2019. And then it has, in the proposal for this new regulation, it is also reminded, it's announced in the introduction section of this proposal. The main objective of this observatory is to provide transparent and open and transparent and free information on the dedicated platform, online platform, related to both the issues of deforestation and forest degradation and the trade of commodities between European imports in EU with from third countries. So there are three key activities for this observatory. It's monitoring change in forest cover and degradation globally, monitoring the trade consumptions of commodities and products which are possibly associated with deforestation and forest degradation, and then a feasibility study on how to link potentially these two actions. And this information will be provided through a web-based online platform. So to go a little bit more in detail of what will be the components of that observatory, there will be a pan-European monitoring, which is not probably of so much interest here, on monitoring of pressures on forest. There will be also a component on assessing harvest, so the forestry harvest levels from EU to global scales. There will be the component of monitoring of tropical forest that I will detail a bit. I will focus on that component in my next few slides. And there will be a component on monitoring of trade between the trade of key commodities. And all that will be integrated in a web online platform. So to have a few slides on this component on the monitoring of tropical moist forests, we have at GRC, we have established a system which is working efficiently on all the pan-tropical belt for the moist, so the humid forests. It's based on the one who knows Landsat imagery, so an American satellite at 30-meter resolution, so 0.09 hectare. This is a bit more detailed on what the system is doing. So we get annual updates of this forest cover, tree cover status. The products are available through this this web link, and there's a scientific publication associated to that. I don't know if I have time or if I can switch quickly to if you see it. I don't know if you see my screen. That is the website of where this product is available. It's available to anybody. So I'm just going on the internet for showing that. So if I zoom as we are talking, so it's available at pan-tropical level. If I zoom on Brazil, because it's
Frederick, we still see your slide.
Okay.
So you would need to choose another window in the share screen option to see your browser.
So, yeah. Sorry for that. So, sorry for that. So here, do you see my another window now?
Yes, we see it live now on the internet. Yeah.
So it's what. Sorry for that one issue. So that is the what you can see from this website. So it's pan-tropical. As I said, I can zoom on the Amazon basin because it's of interest for you. So that is the basic product that we have. The remaining forest in 2020 appears in green. We have an annual so we can come back in time. So that is the status of the forest in 2020. That was the forest in 1992 in that part of the world, and we can go year by year. So for the purpose of the regulation proposal, year 2020 is the most interesting. We are processing now year 2021. If I zoom, so we go to, it's a 30-meter resolution product, so it goes to this level of detail. I think so. Maybe I don't need to say much more on that. So that's, as I said, it's available to everybody with the documentation, with the technical documentation associated with that. So if I come back to my presentation. So, and from this data, we can, from these maps, we can produce estimates of areas. So that is an example for what we just produced for the Pan Amazon. It's starting from year 2010. It's showing the total the disturbances that we observe. So by disturbance, we mean deforestation, which is the red bar, and degradation, which is the yellow bar. Degradation is a short-term disturbance, means removal of tree cover, which is a forest will remain a forest, and is removal of tree cover, and the tree cover is regrowing. And it's mainly logging activities, selective logging activities, or burnt area or fires. And what you can see, we have here I'm showing the history since year 2010 for the Amazon up to the year 2021. The scale is in year 2010, it was 4 million hectares in total of disturbances. Now in 2021, so we have processed only part of up to October 2021. We need to process the rest in January. And there is compared to the same period in the previous year, we see a small decrease of the total of disturbances. It's mostly due to the fact that the year 2020 was very dry and there was a lot of burnt areas. So we consider in 2021 is more the fire burnt forests which have decreased. We think that the deforestation has not really decreased for the Pan Amazon. This kind of information, there is a technical report for people who need more information without going down more in details. Technical report which is available by one of my colleagues in our group at the address, the website address that she provided below. And that report was published early this year and was going in detail in our definitions and what we can observe. And you see, and we also compare with existing estimates like the INPE PRODES data or the Global Forest Watch, which is for our community is quite well known. And the simple message that I want to pass here is that there are differences between these estimates due to sometimes the PRODES is using a different time period, the methodology the definition are not necessarily the same, but overall the gross deforestation, the main part of the figures are quite consistent between themselves. You always see, nobody can hide what is happening. You always see the main activities which are happening in these areas. So the future is to go at finer scale, to use Sentinel-2, the European satellite from the Copernicus program, which is called Sentinel-2, which is data we are freely available since year 2015, and they are 10-meter resolution. So we will use that. We are working on that to produce the baseline map for year 2020 at 10-meter resolution. That will take us some time, but each on the process. And we have, if needed, I can also illustrate. We have produced a GRC, composite, which is cloud-free at 20-meter resolution from the Sentinel-2 for year 2020 and for the previous year, 2019-2018. They are available through the website, which is provided below for free. Anybody can access that. But this kind of information is available from other groups. It's just to say that it's now quite easy to process, even if it takes some resources. It's quite easy to get access to this kind of imagery at finer resolution and to produce a cloud-free composite, which can help you to go in more details for assessing forest and forest cover change. On the operational side, so GRC, as I said, we are a scientific body, we develop systems, we demonstrate the feasibility. Over a long term, the European Commission has an operational program called Copernicus for both the launch of satellites and for the funding services, so applications, if you wish. And under this Copernicus program, very soon, next year, there will be a call and for a consortium to implement such what we call the RED Plus monitoring component. It means that it will, what I've just shown before that is implemented by GRC will be operationally implemented by through the Copernicus program by a consortium of companies in Europe. And they will provide, the intention is that they provide access to forest cover maps and deforestation degradation maps from the year 2020 on an annual basis at 10-meter resolution. Well, yeah, if don't give more detail here, but if, I would be open for any questions on that issue. I have two last slides. The observatory will also include component on monitoring of trade. I don't go in details, just to say that I don't think is probably the focus on this seminar today, but just to inform that is also be a part of the major part of the observatory. And finally, as I said, this data set will be available through under a web platform which is presently under development. It will take some time to develop such web platform. Here it's an illustration of the global fragmentation product that has been produced by GRC. So that is the final scope of the observatory to provide this all this information available through a web platform. So thank you for listening. I've finished my presentation, and as anybody I would be happy to answer to any question now or later on in the discussion session.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Frederick. Thank you very much. Some of it was very technical. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, and I can see them already in the question answers. I only want to take one question of clarification now, and that is the one on forest degradation. The regulation has proposed the definition. Is that the one that you monitored from the GRC already? So is which forest degradation definition did you use when you showed the slide? Is it the one that the Commission is proposing for the regulation?
So when we talk from satellite image, we can see a number of things, and so our definitions of what we can monitor is coming from the capability, the remote sensing capabilities. As I said, from GRC, with this monitoring system, and anybody using remote sensing data can do that. We consider degradation when forest is remaining a forest cover. So when we observe in the humid tropics, when we observe a tree cover removal being disturbed and regrowing. So it's corresponding to logging, selective logging activity or fires. In the regulation, the definition is as a multi-purpose. It's mostly saying if a forest on the long term is losing some of its ecosystem services. It's more generic as a definition. What we have to understand is what we'll have to do is to demonstrate that the satellite product, what is produced from Earth observation, can feed the information that is requested by the regulation. And just to be short, to pass another quick message is that the proposal of the regulation from the 6 commodities, which are the 6 key commodities which are highlighted, 5 are mainly leading to deforestation, not degradation. When you talk about palm oil, soy, beef, cocoa, coffee, when the areas of these croplands are increased, they lead to deforestation. They don't lead directly to degradation. It's more the last commodity, which is the wood, which the wood can be extracted from a forest which remains a forest. And here the definition of degradation is important. So in the regulation proposal, the degradation definition is mostly important for the commodity called wood, And that commodity in Europe is mostly imported from non-tropical countries. So maybe I'm starting to go too much in details, but just to say that I don't think that the issue of degradation in the proposal is much an issue for tropical countries. Carolina may correct me, but my understanding from what we have as data, the volume of trade, what is imported in Europe, makes me think that the priorities are those ones.
Okay, thank you, Frederick, very much for this explanation. And I think also Tasso might agree or disagree about degradation not being associated with the commodities you mentioned. But before we move to Tasso, we will actually give the floor to Saskia Osinger, who will present the report co-authored by Professor Peter May and herself. In the interest of time, we will only have one formal presentation, but Peter will come in the discussion session. So as already mentioned, Saskia is Fern's founder and former campaigns coordinator. She has facilitated numerous NGO coalitions to protect forests and strengthen community rights. And she has not only written this report, but over her career has written extensively about forest governance, trade, and effective advocacy on forests and climate. And she is also board member of a few organizations, such as the Rights and Resources Initiative and the Bank Information Center Europe. So Saskia, the floor is yours to present the conclusions of the report.
Thank you, Nicole. So I have to say, Peter did much more of the heavy lifting for the report than I did. So technical questions, I would refer to him. But let's start because we have a short time to do the presentation. Can I have the next slide, please? So we looked extensively at what existing monitoring systems are there in Brazil, looking both at forest and looking both at human rights. We did this research before the Commission presented its draft regulation, and we hoped, and we still hope, that human rights will be included in the amendments from the Parliament. So we looked at forest degradation, forest deforestation, trade, but also in human rights, and particularly community tenure rights and forced labor rights when we looked at when we did this report. Next slide, please. So, as you probably, a lot of you will know, there are many monitoring systems operational in Brazil that monitor deforestation. This is just a short list of the different projects that are listed in our report. Some focus on deforestation, some focus on degradation, some are, alerts, some don't include alert. Some focus on the Amazon, some focus on the Cerrado, some focus or looking at the whole of Brazil. So there's an enormous plethora of deforestation monitoring systems available. Next slide, please. So that leads us to conclude that in Brazil, there is really no need for the EU to find its own data because there are sufficient data sources to source from in Brazil, from different sources, as I said before, some focusing on real-time monitoring, others with focusing on annual and biannual reports. There's more data to choose from than we probably would need. Next slide, please. It's different when we talk about human rights monitoring. And I think it's important here to focus particularly on land tenure, because we know that particularly deforestation for agricultural commodities often, almost always, I would say, goes hand in hand with violation of land tenure of local communities and indigenous peoples. And hence, it would be really important for the EU to really look at that component as well. And at the moment, the regulation, as most of you will know, doesn't really do that. It's not as easy as with deforestation because there is not one-stop online database which allows you to cross-reference agricultural expansion with land-use conflicts. But there are databases which allow you to at least assess whether there are land conflicts, like the INCRA, the National Initiative for Colonization and Agricultural Reform. They have a big database which have identified millions of hectares of indigenous peoples and Colombolas land. But also ISA, Instituto Socioambiental, they have a georeference database which has at least 361 properties legalized in the legal Amazon. So it's not that the data are not there, but it requires a little bit more digging to get the data out there. And we think that's really critical also because we know that deforestation is much less in areas which are owned and managed by indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide, please. Similar with forced labor, it's probably important to mention that particularly in the livestock sector, in the meat producing sector, more than half of the cases of forced labor take place in that sector. And as meat is one of the big things we import from Brazil, that's an important thing to be aware of. And there are data to assess whether there is forced labor in supply chain, slightly less data to see if there's child labor, which is of course an EU priority as well to tackle child labor. There's government data like the RADA Statistics and Information Dashboard. There's also judicial data, there's NGO data, and everybody probably has heard of the Registry of Offending Employers known as the dirty list, which once you're on that list as a company, you're on that list for 2 years and you are a liability. So you won't get the investment, and hence it's been proven quite an important deterrent. So again here, if you were going to include that in the regulation, it's possible to find the data here, but not as straightforward as with deforestation. Next slide, please. So looking at the deforestation regulation, again, I have to say this report was written and researched before the regulation came out. And we have more recommendations than these three, but I want to zoom in on these three. The people who are monitoring trade data, and I'm intrigued to hear how the observatory is going to do that when Frederick said that trade is one of the things that they're really going to look at. The people who we have spoken to in the research for the report who look at trade data, they feel that there is not enough disaggregated customs data available for these forest risk commodities. And if these data were to be required to be made available both at the producer country level and at the EU importing level, including all the tax code, then it would be a hell of a lot easier to really find and trace these data, these commodities. So that would be the first recommendation. The second recommendation, Carolina showed us Article 27 of the regulation, which is going to be the article which is going to be used to assess whether countries are going to be high risk or low risk. We strongly believe that if a country doesn't produce a map of all the existing concessions and the ownership data linked with these concessions, it should almost always be high risk, because the country should be really transparent about where the concessions are and who owns them. That would make it a lot easier to sort of trace the products from one end to another end. And at the moment, that's not a requirement in the regulation as yet. And last but not least, as Indigenous people's rights are such an important part of the problem, we think that if a country shows it shows that it's really serious in clarifying and regularizing and gazetting and demarcation indigenous territories, it should be recognized for that. After all, almost all countries have signed up to the voluntary guidelines of governance of tenure. And if they were implementing these guidelines properly and like I said, respect, demarcate and gazette indigenous territories, then that should be a positive step, and that should be seen as a positive step in the regulation. And again, that's not in the regulation as it stands at the moment. So that's in terms of the key recommendations for the regulation. I have 2 slides left to talk about the recommendations for the Forest Observatory. Next slide, please. So the first one is, we think it's really important that the observatory builds on the available data. If there are official data like in Brazil, then they really should be built on and used. But it's also important because data is just one thing. And to really understand the data and to try to understand where these data are coming from, it's really important that the observatory starts working together with local NGOs and academics as well to understand the patterns. And ground truthing is important because the data in itself sometimes are misleading. For instance, if we look at cattle, it's often the deforestation finds place at the case where the cattle is being fed. Well, if you only then trace to the slaughterhouse, then you miss where the cattle have moved to at a later stage, then you miss the whole the whole pattern. So it's understanding not just to look at the data, but also understand what's behind the data, and hence work closely with local NGOs and academics specifically. It would be also very helpful if the observatory harmonizes and aligns existing data sets. And as importantly, particularly for big countries like Brazil and Indonesia, which are huge, bigger than almost the whole of Europe, if you're just going to monitor at the country level, and you're going to say the whole country like Brazil is red listed or green listed or yellow listed, that's a very crude way of looking at the problem. So we think it's really important that you're going to look much more at state level or other jurisdictional level when you're going to go to the benchmarking stage. Next slide, please. And this is more about the information flows. It's data, to make sure that the data are useful, it's important to realize who these data are for and in what form do they need to be presented to make sure that people can use them. So it's really important for the observatory to be really clear who needs to have access to their data and how would these people use the data to make best use of it. And also link with existing databases. And last but not least, to really look for, be creative and flexible so that it can adopt new technologies, particularly isotope testing, which is growing fast, to make it easier to identify where products are really coming from. Last slide, please. So this is the website where you can find the report. There will be two reports. One is a large report, which is about 80 pages, and one is a summary report. So I would really recommend everybody to read the summary report, and it's a work in progress. This is our thinking at this moment in time. We would love to continue working on this with the observatory and with the commission and with all of everybody who's in the seminar and wants to contribute to it. So please, comments are very welcome if you have any comments on the short version of the report or the long version of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. Thanks for being so synthetic with also our 80 pages report. Thanks a lot. I answered one question about forest degradation monitoring systems in the chat as information for the person who posted it. We will now move on. We're a bit behind time to Tasso from Brazil. Welcome, Tasso. So Tasso is a forest engineer and the general coordinator of Mapiomas, which is a platform to produce annual land cover and land use maps of Brazil, but also the Amazon basin, Indonesia, and other regions. He was previously the director of the National Forest Program at the Ministry of Environment and the General Secretary of the National Forest Commission in Brazil. He was also the first Chief and Director General of the Brazilian Forest Service and one of the key people involved in the design and implementation of the National Plan to Combat Deforestation, which resulted in 80% reduction of deforestation in the Amazon between 2004 and 2012. These were indeed great times. Tasso, we are very interested in hearing your thoughts and recommendations. You have participated in our webinar in elaboration of our report. You have now heard the European Commission's Joint Research Centre recommendations and plans, how it's going to go about monitoring. Yeah, what is your view on this?
Okay, cool. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Very fast. So I will concentrate on deforestation or not touch on the degradation. It's another big issue, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll just talk about the deforestation. So in summary, I see those as the key challenge for the deforestation-free assurance. The first one obviously relies on the definition of deforestation. Depends on the type of vegetation of ecosystem to be included. So if you're talking about, for example, not including savannas and grasslands, for example, you take it out 40% of the deforestation in Brazil, just as an example. The other one is the definition of the minimum age of the forest. If you're just considering primary forests, or you're also considering secondary forests or secondary vegetation. That's also, I will show some data that shows that what's the difference of considering just primary forests versus also secondary forests, and the different ages of the secondary forest makes also difference. So there is also this challenge of defining the tier of the countries in terms of what would be the asks in terms of assurance. And so one thing is you need to be able to analyze the history of the land use change, so you can make the links of deforestation and commodity production. And also you have to analyze the deforestation rate of all the country or jurisdiction, and not just like one region or another. And then there is this this direct link between the deforestation post-2020 and the production area. And there is two big challenges here. One is the establish of the geolocation of the production area of the target commodities beyond just like the first layer where you get for example, you get the cattle, but where exactly all this has been produced, for example. And then there is this other challenge, which is to establish the link between the deforestation and production and the production area that you define. So you need to know, in the case of Brazil, that will be a requirement to have a link with the registry of the property, the CAR, for every area considered for production to enter into Europe. And you also have to have every deforestation in the country reported in a way that you can link the deforestation to the CAR. So that would be like the two challenge. So I would just show here two of the platforms that we work that try to answer most of this, that will be able to answer or be ready to answer any one of those questions, except the establishment of the geolocation of the production area on a target community, which means like the traceability itself, right? Which is a separate subject that I will not deal with right now. So Mapiomas is a network of universities, NGOs, and startups that are dedicated to understand land use change in Brazil. And there is other groups also working in other regions. I will talk specifically about two of the initiatives inside Mapiomas. One is the monitoring, the annual monitoring of land use and land cover, and the other one is the deforestation alerts. So for the monitoring of the land use land cover, we want to go beyond the forest gain and forest loss, and understand really all the transitions that are happening on the territory. To do that, we produce historical maps of land cover, land use in Brazil, processing Landsat image on 30 by 30 meters, pixel by pixel, using artificial intelligence and working on a collaborative network, and it's all cloud-based processing. The maps today, they evolve every year, but today we have 25 classes being monitored since '85 all the way to 2020, which includes pasture, soybean, coffee, and others that are targeted in the EU proposal. Yeah, so the idea is that once we produce those maps, we have a platform where you can actually see in time and space what is happening on the whole territory in terms of the change. If you take any point on the map, like there is 9.5 billion pixels in Brazil of 30 by 30 meters, for each one of them, you have the history. So for example, for this picture in the screen here, you see that it was forest from '85 to 2002, and then for 2 years it was pasture, and then turned into agriculture. Then you have the different types of agriculture there. So because you have the history of each one of the pixels, then you can have histories of any part of the country that you define. So, and you can see this over time in the platform. So this, for example, is Mato Grosso in '85, then in 2000, and then in 2020, you see a lot of transformation happening on the territory. Just for a reference, what is pink here is agriculture. What is yellow is pasture land. The different types of green is different types of native vegetation, for example. So, and I can do this in all levels of, territorial definition. So, for example, if I take one of the municipalities in Brazil, in this case is Sinop in Mato Grosso, you can see it in '85 and 2020. You see a big transformation, but then you want to see what are the changes that are happening. So in this platform, you can see the change by asking for any pair of years. So if you want to see the change between, let's say, 2000 and 2012, you can see on the platform what it changed specifically in this time period that you want. And you can also see the specific transition that you are interested in. For example, in this case, I'm interested on the transition from forest to farming, any type of farming. And so it gives me back on the map where you have this specific transition from forest to farming. And then you can plot all the properties, which are the gray lines here. And you will see for each property the specific transition that you are interested in. So you can really understand what's going on from the level of the whole country, any area that you are interested all the way to the level of a property. One of the important things about this type of analysis that you see, like the land use cover all over the time, is that you can also understand what is secondary vegetation. For example, today we estimated we have about 48 million hectares of secondary vegetation, which will normally not appear on monitoring systems that are just tracking the deforestation, because they track the deforestation once and then it's considered that there is no like forest anymore. So why this is important? Because when you look at deforestation in Brazil, considering primary vegetation and then secondary vegetation, it's growing. The part of secondary vegetation is growing much faster than actually the deforestation on primary land. So like in 2019, the area that was clear cut in secondary vegetation, it's almost the same that you have on primary vegetation. So this definition, it will be very important, especially in places like the Atlantic rainforest and other and biomes like that. All of that is available for checking and use, both by downloading data, also all the codes that we use and etc. is all free and open to anyone to use. Now, this is like for understanding the the annual trends that is happening everywhere. Now, it's important to understand what is happening as we go. During the year, if you have the deforestation happening. So we are working. We have this system called Deforestation Alerts, where we build up on the various experience that we have in Brazil on monitoring deforestation. There are several systems monitoring deforestation, and then what we do is to take each one of those deforestation detection methods that exist, and we take one by one each one of the deforestation that was detected, and we find out, we place it precisely in time and space. So we look at the image in high resolution, like 3-meter resolution for planet, and we look at the deforestation before it happens and after it happens. So you can define precisely when it happens and what exactly is the area that was detected. So for each one, and I'm saying each one because it's each one, every single deforestation detected after January 2019 by any one of those systems, PRODES, DETER, SAGE from Amazon, Global Forest Watch, and etc., one by one, we analyze one by one, and then we set precisely what is the deforestation area and when it happens with the image before and after in high resolution. Then we cross this information with all the data sets from protected areas, indigenous lands, authorizations from the different environmental organizations and so on. And then we produce specific reports for each one of those deforestation lands. So it's turning the information of there is a deforestation happening here to a full report for each one of those alerts. So this goes to a platform again. And so each, red thing here is one deforestation event in Brazil since January 2019. And for each one of them, you will have like the image before and after. And you have a specific reports for. So every time a deforestation alert crosses with a property that is registered, this property receives a report, and have a report prepared and available in the platform. So those reports are customizable by the different organizations. But the most important fact is like you can find if there is a deforestation happening after January 2019, if it happens, if you have a geolocation or if you have a code of the property. This allows for understanding what's going on. And in this case, we are considering primary forest and also secondary forest. Anything that was that is forest at that moment when it was clear cut. So all of that is in the platform online, and have all the different ways to access the data, shape files, database, and etc. And so what I was showing this, like it's possible to actually deal with any type of definition of deforestation. It's possible to have the trajectories to define the tiers of the country with land use analysis. And it's possible to establish right away today, we don't have to create anything new, to establish the link between the deforestation and production area. The only part I think it's missing here, it's not missing, but it's another problem to solve, is how to track back the product that's going on in Europe to the specific place where it's produced. And with that, I'll finish here.
Tasso, thank you very much. Also very complex and very impressive of what's possible to monitor in Brazil. I'll take up one question from the chat. I think a colleague from the Joint Research Center who disputed our recommendation that existing systems should be used, especially if higher resolution systems like Sentinel-2 will become available, and his question on whether you will also integrate and work with Sentinel-2, so at a higher spatial resolution than you currently do, Tasso.
Yeah, so we have a version of the data set for land cover, land use with Sentinel. The only limitation is that it's like, in terms of history, it just goes back to maybe 2016. So since we really understand the long-term trend, so we will keep doing this with Landsat, because then you can have the long-term vision. But yeah, but it's possible to include very good images.
Okay, very, very good. Thanks. That's very good news. With this, we move to the second final presentation, and we will already address some comments in the chat, which are about, are there geospatial data kind of overlaying these deforestation events with indigenous peoples' territories and human rights violations. And so we will explore this now with Adriana Ramos. Adriana coordinates the policy and law program of the Instituto Socioambiental. She has been working on advocacy to improve social and environmental legislation and policies related to indigenous people's rights, tropical forests and other ecosystems in Brazil for over 25 years. And she was also a member of the Brazilian NGO Association Board of Directors until 2008. So with that, Adriana, please enlighten us of what's possible and what's necessary in terms of human rights monitoring.
Thanks, Nicole. It was really interesting to listen to everybody before I have this chance, because then I will go strictly to a few points. I think that for us, the observatory should be a very important tool in terms of inducing free deforestation and human rights violations free chain, but we have a lot of concerns on that. The first concern, I think, is that we should really bring human rights violation to be monitored together with deforestation. The other concern is that although we have all this set of data bases and monitoring systems, we are seeing a reduction of budget, for example, for the National Institute on Space Research, responsible for PRODIS and DETER, which are the two main tools. That is very critical. So this year, for example, they only had around 300,000 euro to work. So it's important that the Brazilian government keeps the support, although, as we have seen from Tasso, the map biomas also joins other information and can also provide. So I think that one very important thing is that different sources of information should be considered by the observatory. Our actual government is very explicit in demonstrating its detachment from transparency and no commitments with social control. So, and the fact that the Brazilian government omitted the deforestation data during the COP, although they already knew, it's a very strong example on that. So reduced social participation in bodies that are, for example, monitoring child labor and Also reduction of budget for fiscalization of slavery labor is also a key issue. As Saskia has already said, these are two critical situations in the agribusiness sector. But what I want to highlight as one of the most important things I see is related to what the Brazilian government has been doing in terms of the procedures of recognition of indigenous territories and also quilombolas territories and other traditional communities' lands. The government is completely against the collective territorial rights. So what they are trying to do is that, although the constitution is very clear in saying that indigenous territories are recognized as original territories, and the procedures of recognition will only, formalize it. The government is trying to set that indigenous territories are only those that have finished these procedures. So they are taking out from some of the land information systems in Brazil the indigenous territories that are not fully homologated. So for example, when we get the CAR, the environmental register, as Tasso showed, which is a very important tool because it's the only tool that would allow to identify the landowners. This is a self-declared register, you know? And when it's declared, the landowner can declare an area that is overlapped with collective demands, you know? And if those collective demands are not formalized yet, or if the procedure haven't finished, the government can recognize the self-register of the landowner, you know, overlapping with other interests of collective interests and increasing a lot conflicts. We have seen in the last years a huge increase of deforestation inside indigenous territories, mainly stimulated by the government. And this is very problematic because if the CAR enable recognition of private interests over these collected lands, we will have strong problems in terms of how this will be used, you know, to legitimate production over these areas. I think that another topic of concern is on the changes on social environmental legislation that will increase the cases in which deforestation will be considered legal in Brazil, you know, and that relates a lot to the announcements that the Brazilian government have made internationally, because mainly they are saying that they are committing to reduce illegal deforestation, but they are increasing the cases in which deforestation will be supported by the Brazilian legislation, especially with legislations like this one that is being discussed these days on land tenure regularization, you know. So it seems that there will be a strong homework for us in Brazil, you know, to guarantee that the quality of the data and the transparency is on track, but also that the observatory will have to consider different sources of information in order to have a clear overview on what's happening on the ground, you know. And we hope that in this 2 years of discussion that we can raise these concerns and try to set a tool that will take advantage on the information we already have, the knowledge we already have, to guarantee that what's monitored is exactly what is happening, and that we will not support to legitimate production that is based on human rights violation. You know? So I think that we'll have a lot of work in the next 2 years on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, for reminding us of the big challenges ahead. And yeah, I hope we can continue the discussion on this topic. There are also questions already in the chat with relations to human rights and the regulation, which I will take later. I will first move to the last panelist, Peter May, who is a full professor of the Department of Development, Agriculture and Society of the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil since 1991. And he's also the author of several books in the areas of ecological economics, agroforestry, payment for ecosystem services, and environmental policy. He's also the founder and former president of the Brazilian Society for Ecological Economics, and he has directed 3 Brazilian environmental NGOs for over a decade. And as mentioned, he is also the co-author of our report, so we would very much like to hear your view, Peter, on on the presentations. How do you classify them with what we have written before what you have written before the regulation came out, and what do you think will be some reactions in Brazil to this proposal?
Right. Thank you very much, Nicole, and thanks very much also to all of the previous presenters. I think we have a very, very strong complementary picture to the study results that we have also earlier presented in an earlier debate. And I certainly do not have any really substantive information to provide additional to what Saskia provided regarding the main points of our report. It was done, as you know, before the regulation was actually issued. And I think that the regulation reflects the messages of the 1.2 million comments that were received by the Commission. That's really a record. I think that it's obviously an issue that has gained an awful lot of mileage in discussions globally about the global commons, and how and to what extent we can expect that global regulation or regional regulation between markets and sources of goods can be a means of assuring that the global commons is better protected, as well as the indigenous and native peoples who are reliant on those the global commons for those for ensuring that those goods are derived from locations where they are not impacting and not denigrating the conditions of those peoples. I think that we have a very insufficient knowledge still of the relationship between trade and commodity production. I think Tasso has hit the main issue on the head by looking at the problem of cross-tabulating the specific coordinates of the sources of commodities and where those commodities are going in a tracing situation. That means a lot more than going with a better basis for saying, well, there's deforestation happening in such and such a region or municipality, and then saying, well, that soybean from that particular municipality is definitely going into a European market where it is contaminating the product with deforestation or human rights violations for that matter. Certainly, that's even worse in terms of being able to coordinate the specific regions or jurisdictions within which such violations are occurring. So the question is, to what extent is the regulation going to be able to monitor, to permit monitoring of the specific sources of the goods in terms of where they're coming from, and to what extent the regulation itself can then be a means to stimulate producers and commodity traders to press for greater control over deforestation. And I think that's kind of the key underlying issue in the regulation. What is the justification that the Europeans are consuming deforestation-related commodities and is a driver, but it's only one driver, and there are other markets and there are other rationales that go beyond the trade itself as being the source of the deforestation that's taking place. So to what extent is the observatory able to track and analyze the drivers that are contributing to the specific trade-related influences? I also think that there's it's important to consider what kind of incentives might be available. I mean, we now see some effort on the part of the finance industry, including the Brazilian central bank, to express concern about greening the commodities that are coming out of Brazil, and to require due diligence from the finance sector. But to what extent is the finance industry, I think, has pretty much been written off as having a role in this, in the discussion that went behind the regulation. So I'm wondering to what extent there is just correctly pointing the finger at where the sources of pressure may be that are causing the deforestation that is taking place, and how can not only market incentives but also fiscal incentives and credit incentives be used and as tools to regulate the source of deforestation. So those are just thoughts additional to all the points that Adriana has raised and Tasso, which are very coherent and very cogent to the problem at stake. We have a situation in Brazil in which the dismounting of the regulatory system associated with land use and associated with indigenous rights imply serious risks associated with commodity production, and that obviously there has also been a considerable pushback on the part of the agribusiness community toward any form of external regulation. So you have both internal regulation being disposed of by Congress and by the presidency, and you have opposition to external regulation. So if there's any regulation at all, it's going to have to come from consumers, and it's a very indirect way of getting at this. So I think that there will be an important role to play in making the observatory a environment for collaboration and cooperation between groups who are monitoring deforestation from the third sector, as well as involving more coherently the role of traders and the finance sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for this assessment and putting the many presentations and the law into perspective. We now move to the second part of this webinar, which is questions and answers. We have many questions, 26, at least 23 still open from the audience. There are 4 themes with which I would like to start. That is this difference the Commission is making, at least initially, between forests and other ecosystems. It's about this geolocation requirements of plots of farm rather than plots of land rather than the boundaries of the exact farm. I'd like to go back to degradation and about monitoring human rights, whether international or national laws apply. But maybe first to the question of forests and other ecosystems, I would like to ask the panelists to all switch on their camera again, please. So the question which was voted for most was like, why does the Commission only look in the first instance at protecting forests and not other ecosystems? I think we have seen from TASO that monitoring other ecosystems, native vegetation is possible at the same level. And there can already be calculations made of how much of the Cerrado or not will fall under the regulation with the current definition. So if it's technically possible, why wait another 2 years for the review clause to potentially look at other ecosystems? I think it's maybe a political and a technical question, so I'd like Carolina and Frederick to take a stab at that.
Thank you, Nicole. Perhaps I can start and then Frederick can add the technical angle. From our view, forests are an ecosystem that we have the most information about, and also in terms of satellite monitoring is something that is, let's say, the data is the most available in order to have a regulation on it. As mentioned, we will in 2 years after the adoption, we aim to launch a study assessing the possibilities to extending the scope of the regulation to other ecosystem. Specifically, for example, on a Brazilian Cerrado, however, if you look at the definition on forests and at the physical properties that are part of the definition, which follows the FAO definition, we estimate that about 2/3 of Brazilian Cerrado would be covered under the forest definition and thus also protected under our regulation. So the definition as such does not exclude the ecosystems such as savannas, but of course with wetlands and other ecosystems, it's a bit more difficult. Please, Frederick, if you would complement it with technical details. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. From my side, maybe what the comment that if I understand well, and also it was maybe also presented by TASO, there are systems which indeed do not consider forestry growth, like PRODES. PRODES, once they have mapped forest as deforested, then they forget about it. It's masked out and doesn't reappear. So it's not, if it's considered, if it's regrowing as a degraded forest, it doesn't appear anymore under the PRODES system. So I can agree that, and it's not the case in our system, and it will not be the case in the Copernicus operational monitoring system, where if a forest a tree cover is removed temporarily and regrowing as a degraded forest or a forest regrowth, it appears as forest regrowth in our system. So that will be tackled and that will be considered as a forest. So I think that was probably one of the main concerns. The definition of the forest which appears in the regulation is not limited to primary forest. So that's the non-primary forest will be considered as well. I think I can probably that complements what Carolina says. I don't think that we need to say more at that stage.
Mm-hmm. So you do think that for the other ecosystems, it's too difficult to monitor in the first instance, or what would be your rationale to only start with this definition of forests, Frederick?
Sorry, the regulation focuses on forests, on deforestation and forest degradation. So if you are talking about other ecosystems than forests, that is not tackled by the regulation. The second part of the answer is maybe you are mentioning that our GR system is focusing on the tropical moist forest. The reason is a reason of resources. We'll start looking at the dry forest ecosystems. It's a matter of resources of the team. When I saw the picture of TASO at the end of the biomass team, I I would dream to have such a manpower. So how many number of people that he has to. Of course, the capability, what you can do depends on how many people. And basically, our tropical moist forest was developed by two people, and so we'll add one for the dry ecosystem. So you have to realize that it's what we can do is related to resources. You can put a long wish list, but at the end, if you have a limit, the resources do not decrease. You have to replace. If you want to do more or something else, you have to stop something. But we intend to look at the dry ecosystems and the Copernicus operational, under Copernicus operational program, the monitoring system should be pan-tropical, including all tree cover types in the pan-tropics as a start. And ideally, on the long term, it will be global.
Maybe
Thank you very much. Yes, Tasso, if you can briefly respond. Yeah.
No, I just comment two things. One thing, I think the question of the secondary vegetation or secondary forest is actually where you draw the line, what you'll be considering, a secondary vegetation that you will consider a new deforestation. Because that's, in some parts, this will be part of the, of the management of the land, where you remove and then you use for some years, then you leave it, and then you come back after some years, and etc. So I think this is one type of definition that will have to be established in order to. But for example, the map that I showed and the data that I showed, the 48 million hectares of secondary vegetation, it's considering a 3-year period of regeneration. If you consider 6 years, for example, then this area is half of this. Just to have, so that's I think the issue. In terms of the other vegetation, I think again the problem is where you draw the line. So I mean, a lot of the deforestation. Well, first there is a question of wording, right? In Portuguese, deforestation it's translated to desmatamento, and mata in Portuguese it's bush. Would be like bush. It's like it involves forest and non-forest vegetation. So when we talk about deforestation-free desmatamento in Brazil, it's very important that you make this distinction. And it's, if we don't include cerrado, for example, then it's a big issue, because a lot of the cerrados we're losing the areas totally under pressure now. So this is where you will have the leakage, and that's where you will have all the pressure afterwards, saying like, oh, you have a policy that is actually just leaving many things to pass. Yeah, and the last point is just a reference. Like, I think I understand the idea of having a place where if you don't have an information, I mean, you never have an excuse to not have an information. So you can rely on something that is produced centralized by GRC to have some kind of a minimal information. So if a country or a region don't have information, here is information available. But it should not be a limitation. So if it's used as a limitation, say like, oh, we will limit what we can do with this legislation to what it's possible to do using GRC, I think it's a loss of opportunity, because the main, like Brazil and Indonesia, is like two main countries where, this big part of the problem, there is, a lot of information available that could be used. So I would think on something that you can draw on the information that is available and not just like limit what the legislation can do by what you have on the on GRC, which I think it's very important to have, because then you have a baseline for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. With that, I would like to move to one of the second questions, which was about the definition of the plots, the coordinates of the plot of land that need to be provided, and that would be the exact coordinates of the plot of land of the, I guess, batch of commodities or products that comes into the EU. In previous discussion, it has come up whether that would then not mean that products could be laundered through a farm which has several plots of land. So how am I sure that these products really come from that plot of land? This is really clear. Why has the Commission chosen this route, so to go through a clean plot of land rather than a clean farm? Could you maybe elaborate, Carolina?
Thank you. We chose the definition of plot of land to exactly prevent the risk of laundering, because in case of very large farm, that is case, for example, in Indonesia or Brazil, we wanted to avoid a situation that one farm would declare itself as deforestation free, when in reality they would have one, let's say, one plot that is deforestation free, but 10 others that are subject to deforestation. So the definition does refer to a farm, which if you look at it, refers to a single real estate property, but does ask to tie the commodity to a specific plot of land and provide the geolocation data for this specific plot of land. I hope this is a bit clearer now.
Thanks. Tasso, do you think that's possible for the buyer in the EU to actually obtain that information and trace it back? Will the requirement by the law be enough to produce that information? Tasso, you're on mute.
Let's just talk about the experience that is happening right now in Brazil, and then you can have an idea. So we have this, the Banco do Brasil, which is the main funder of agriculture. Since 1st of July this year, they're using the information on the alert system, Mapioma's alerts, to define whether they will give credits or not. So the way they're doing now is actually looking to the plot, to the area in which the farmer is asking the grant to the funds to plant, right? So, and it has to be, always has to be a polygon. So first thing to do is say, I think this should be a requirement that you don't have a point, you need to have a plot. That's one thing. So the way they're doing that is just look into that specific area that you say that you will plant. But the goal is to advance this to be the whole property. So if you have this property and you have an illegal, or in their case, illegal deforestation, in your case, deforestation after 2020, that impacts the whole property. Because you can't guarantee that the production is coming from that specific place or that other specific place. So I think that's the easiest directly way to do this in Brazil. You look at you must have a car. So you have to say, well, this is the car. And then you check if there is a deforestation in that car. If there is a deforestation on that car, then it's blocked for that will be the easiest way to do it, to guarantee.
Okay, so you would go.
But it's possible to do both ways. It's just saying that and has to be a polygon. This idea of having just one point makes no sense, because normally the points will be like the the office or the house of that area. So most of the time you'll not have you have a building or something like that.
Great, thanks. I think that was quite clear. There was also a lot of questions about human rights aspects of the law, in the sense of the law will require the compliance with laws in the country of production. We understand that to be national laws and not go as far as international human rights norms and standards, which might not have been nationalized, so to say, in local law. So a lot of maybe community and customary tenure would not fall under the regulation. And a question associated with that in the chat was, well, what does a company have to do? I mean, who will monitor the legal status of the several laws in these countries? Is that the company? What does the company have to do to comply? I think for deforestation we have the geolocation and the import declaration, but what does it have to do on the legality aspect of the law? Carolina, this question is again for you.
Thank you. We are, of course, aware that deforestation and forest degradation are very often linked to human rights violations, also especially for indigenous people and in general people who live their livelihoods depend from forests. That's why we do include link to also to legality of the land that the commodities are produced on. We do refer to national laws, but of course, if the country is party of an international convention on human rights or other relevant conventions, and meaning that they have ratified and are party to the convention, this means that the relevant laws are to be respected, and if they are not respected, it would mean a violation of the national law. So in that respect, the regulation does cover also human rights violation if relevant. We also hope that through the regulation and through promotion of deforestation-free supply chains, we will motivate the operators to make sure that the sourcing only comes from land that is in line with the legal legislation of the country, also in terms of human rights. In terms of the obligation of the who will check those rights, this is a operator's responsibility to look at this conditions of the land. We will also take into account the national laws under the country assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering whether, Adriana, you were waving and wanted to come in, or no? Okay. I think you've already mentioned, I mean, you built a bridge to my next question, Carolina, that is about incentives. And I think some view the benchmarking probably as an incentive, some as a carrot, some as a stick. So I think the idea behind the benchmarking is to be the stick, because a high risk rating could have a reputational risk. It also entails more duties on the operator and more inspections by the competent authority and so on. But it's a stick. And do you see any way of incentivizing through the benchmarking potentially also, and through the Forest Observatory? We've heard in previous discussion that maybe the risk rating should not only be done at national level, also at subnational level. I think you've also mentioned that is what's currently in the regulatory text, so parts of a country. Are there any thoughts about giving preferential access or other positive incentives for greener or lower risk jurisdictions? Or how else could benchmarking be used, if not only as stick but also as a carrot?
Thank you. So in the first place, we hope that the whole regulation will serve as an incentive for producers that source from deforestation-free areas, because of course the whole regulation will make it easier for the producers to kind of be the pioneers in terms of placing on the market of deforestation-free products. In terms of benchmarking, as mentioned, there is possibility to acquire the low risk status under the proposal, and if a country will be assessed as a low risk, the operators sourcing from these countries will be able to use the simplified due diligence, meaning they will not have to provide all information required under the due diligence. So this will be, it will be a bit easier for them to place the products on the market. Also, the benchmarking we see as a facilitation tool for trade because it provides signals to both the operators and enforcement agencies in the European Union on where the sourcing is, let's say, yeah, it's low risk and is complete or is connected to negligible risk in terms of placing on the market. So in our view, all elements of the regulation playing together are providing the market incentives more than a stick, as you mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to stay on the benchmarking a little bit. There was a question by Jonathan Zeitlin, and Saskia wanted to answer this question live. So the question was about whether the benchmarking should also be done specifically for commodity groups. I think it's not yet totally clear to the audience how the benchmarking will be done, as there are so many factors that will be compounded for the risk rating. And Jonathan also has a question about the definition of forest degradation, and I wonder, Saskia, which part of Jonathan's question did you want to answer?
I think that highlights my lack of knowledge of the technology, because I tried to answer a question from Duncan, because Duncan tried to link to the long report, which I referred to at the end of my presentation, and said that the link doesn't work. So I just checked with my colleagues in the meantime, and I can say that the link will work from tonight onwards, because the report is just coming from the designer today. So that was my my response to Duncan's question in the chat about, you know, where is the link to the long report, which will come tonight.
Okay, and your response to Jonathan about country risk benchmarking?
Well, it was a question to Carolina I saw in Jonathan's question, which I think is a good question. And we hear different information from the Commission if the benchmarking will only be done at country level, and whether or not or how it will link with possible guidelines for commodities. So where does the discussion on commodities come in linked with the benchmarking of the countries, or is that going to be completely delinked, or is there not going to be any listing of commodities guidelines at all? I would be keen to hear that from Carolina as well. And I also would like to come back on the human rights if there's time, Nicole, as well at some point.
Mm-hmm. Great, so let's stay with benchmarking first. Carolina, the ball is back in your court.
Yes, thank you. On whether the benchmarking will be per commodity or let's say general per country or its parts, this is actually an open issue. So as you can see in the article, we will be also, this whole article is still a subject of discussions, and we have put kind of a legal act inside that will that enables the Commission to either add a criteria or a bit define better the direction of the assessment. So unfortunately, I don't have a conclusive answer for you in this area. As also mentioned, this is a draft proposal, and especially on this article, we do expect a lot of discussions with the member states. Thank you.
Thank you. Saskia, now might be a good time to follow up on the human rights.
Well, I was just going to make the point that I was very happy to hear Carolina say that countries that have signed international conventions on human rights and hence have ratified those conventions, that automatically becomes part of the national law in the country and hence need to be adhered to. I think that's important for all of us to hear and to be clear about. Just to reiterate the point that it's often difficult to assess because there is all this sort of legal differences between constitutional law, national law, and customary law. And sometimes, like Cameroon is a good example, where the constitution clearly recognizes customary rights. And international law, which Cameroon has signed up to, does that as well. But the national law deliberately doesn't do that. So you often end up with a legal conflict, which is difficult to solve for a competent authority. And if you would refer to international human rights norms in the law, that would be easier to solve. That's the only point I wanted to add to that discussion.
Thanks a lot. Are there any reactions from other panelists on this? No, then I think also the point of forest degradation has created quite a few questions in the chat. And Frederick, you have pointed out monitoring, especially for forest degradation for wood. And some comments in the chat relate to forest degradation being quite important to monitor for other commodities like cocoa, but also it's an issue going on in indigenous peoples' territories. So maybe a question of clarification that forest degradation is will indeed need to be monitored by the operator also for the other commodities, or how strong of a criterion will that be? Is it actually possible to quantify or not? Yeah.
Maybe some general comments. One is that for, let's say, for cattle, soy, and etc., the degradation is less an issue directly, because it will be when you show where it will be produced, will be an area without the forest, so we'll not see the degradation because there will be no forest there. So the degradation will be more related to the fire in this case. Now, when it comes to wood, like timber, then the degradation is the distinction between sustainable forest management and non-sustainable forest management. And technically, it's possible to separate them because they have very different patterns, especially on the roads design, etc. So there are, yeah, you can do this by remote sensing. You can make this distinction for forests. Where it comes to the problem is where you go into cocoa, as you mentioned, or even coffee in certain regions, where you have the mix of, cocoa and coffee inside forests. But then there is another big debate about this, whether, it's better a cocoa inside of forest, or it's better a cocoa that is coming from an area that has been clear cut before and has no forest. So it's a good philosophical discussion also. So just to think about.
Yes, this relates nicely to a comment in the chat by Violaine, where she's saying, just a small comment on which commodities lead to deforestation versus degradation. Actually, cocoa is a cause of degradation, as in some countries it's planted under tree cover, which is then gradually cleared to become agroforestry systems. Yeah, with that, I think we have time to move to more more questions. There are quite a lot, so I'm trying to see whether there is any pattern emerging, and I'm seeing here an interesting one from James Hewitt, who asked the question: should due diligence require assessments of when rights to land were obtained and when the land use was changed? Any operator procuring from land allocated or cleared during the Bolsonaro era would be exposed to reputational risk, perhaps a strong deterrent. Is this really true? Do you have any reflection on that? So the cutoff date is 2020. I think a lot of NGOs have asked it for be more in the past, not necessarily related to the current government, but because it would amnesty a lot of deforestation in the past. Would it not be better to bring this cutoff date, I guess, forward is a question.
If I may, on the cutoff date, it has been chosen in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals number 15, and where the countries have committed to halt deforestation by 2020. Of course, this goal has not been achieved, but this is also a tangible date where we can reasonably assume that that countries have countries global actually and global on global level have committed to a certain goal. Some year that would prior to that would face a bit of let's data availability issues and also retroactivity problems, and that's why in our opinion the cutoff date of 2020 is the most reasonable for the purposes of our regulation. And in terms, I think, I'm sorry, now I forgot the question. In terms of what the operator has to provide as part of due diligence, there is quite a long list of their obligations, and part of it, it's Article 9. If you have the regulation open, and the last information requirement is also related to relevant legislation, which includes also the rights linked to the relevant plot of land.
Okay, great. Want to quickly go to TASO. So European Commission Union might say it's not possible to go back, and we have to stick to 2020. What is? Do you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, we can go with that level of detail that we show in terms of seeing high resolution, have an image before and after that is like a picture of the license of the plate of the car crossing the red light, like something like that. We can do this. It's possible to do it from 2017 on, because the images are available and it would be possible to do it. We did since January 2019, but it's possible to go back. But I think that the question here is more, I think it's more simple. And although I would like to see this coming back as far as possible backwards, at least since the approval of the Forest Code, because the Forest Code was let's say, I would say it was very critical for some of the things that are happening. After the approval of the Forest Code in Brazil, actually the deforestation is growing since then. So I think that it's totally unacceptable. So I would love to see that date to be at least 2012. I mean 4%. But I totally understand the idea of having this cutting date very recent. So it decreased the amount of criticism that you can say of, oh, you're putting out legislation that I didn't know before. So I think it's very reasonable in terms of the argument for the operation of the law and the whole friction of the debate, that you start in 2020 or 2021, and then maybe as it goes, you can go backwards afterwards. But I do understand it.
Okay, that's an interesting proposal we haven't heard yet, to go backwards later. Adriana.
No, yeah, just quickly, because I think that the problem then is whether you will consider the legality of the deforestation, because in the case of Brazil, that would guarantee a new amnesty bigger than the one that the Forest Code already gave in 2012. So you will be considering a lot of areas that were illegally deforested.
Yeah, and by the way, if you look at, we analyze, let's say for 2020, we analyze every single deforestation event all over Brazil. Was 74,000 events. And if you look at the area that have signs of illegality, we are talking about 98.9%. So it's like, it's, so the discussion about whether it's legal or illegal, it's, you know, kind of crazy. And I understand, if I understand correctly, if let's say, if the goal in the legislation in Europe is actually to stop deforestation or to, I mean, to maintain the forests globally and etc., then it should not matter if it's legal or illegal. It really doesn't matter. What you don't want to see is the deforestation. So, I mean, because it's easy to legalize all the deforestation. Very easy. It's just like it's one rule that says, oh, it's all legalized. And then, so I think that this distinction is useless.
Can I just clarify this? Actually, we don't make any difference between illegal and legal deforestation after the cutoff date. So we are very aware of the issue that, as you mentioned, it's very easy to make illegal deforestation legal. So when we refer to legality, it has this specific meaning linked to the national laws, but we do not, in terms of deforestation free, we do not make any difference.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Carolina, because the cutoff date relates to deforestation. Cutoff date does not relate to legality. So if you can prove that something is illegal or has been illegal from also before the cutoff date, it still would not be acceptable on the EU market, if correct, right?
Well,
that's why I really understand the cutting date. I would love to have this for 2012 for all deforestation, but I totally understand that you choose 2020.
Yeah.
Carolina, did you wanted to confirm that what Saskia said?
Yeah. So the products that were produced on land that was deforested after 2020 December are not allowed to enter the EU market. For the products before, for the land, let's say before 2020, the operators have to comply with the legislation with doing the mandatory due diligence to prove that it was indeed produced on land that was not deforested. So that is the functioning.
Great. I think we're moving towards the end of the allotted time. I would like to ask one more question, which came up. We discussed a lot about due diligence, the first two steps, so to say, but not the third step of due diligence with its risk mitigation. And here's a question on why what can be considered risk mitigation measures, and why is that not defined in the law, and why is there not a stronger link in the regulation to capacity building of suppliers on risk mitigation? I would like to take that as the final question to Carolina.
Thank you. So the risk mitigation is, of course, linked to in the case where the risk assessment has shown some cause of concern and where no non-negligible risk has arisen. So, and in the Article 10, we do specify what the mitigation measures could be. What can be defined as mitigation level for the capacity building. It is included. It is also included the adequate and proportionate policies and controls and procedures. So it is in overall considered the governance of the quality of the due diligence, and also improving the governance procedures of the operators and of the supply chain in general.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, actually, I would like to thank all panelists for their time to discuss this issue, and I would also like to thank the team organizing this meeting in the back end and the interpreters. So thanks a lot. We will make the recording of this webinar in English and Portuguese available on the website, as well as the long report, as Saskia has mentioned, hopefully at the end of today or sometime tomorrow, but for sure before the holidays. So we'd very much like to stay in touch on this issue. So please reach out, stay in touch, and yeah, until then, happy holidays and a very good New Year to you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Thank you. Good to see you all. Bye now.
Thank
Great.
you.
Merry
Bye-bye.
Christmas.
Daria, the recording is still in progress?